The things that we do over and over form us. They shape who we are. How many of you guys are snoozers? When the alarm goes off, you hit the snooze button? Okay. How many of you are repeat snoozers? Like you do like more than once, more than twice, maybe 2, 3 times. Okay, this was me. Most of my college career, I was a flagrant continual snoozer, just terrible. It would be like 3, 4 times a morning. I would actually plan to snooze for 30 or 40 minutes because I just had to, because I couldn't get up when my alarm went off. And it wasn't that I was lazy. I was a very hardworking snoozer. I worked hard at it. So I would put my alarm clock in places that was difficult to find. So I started just putting it across the room, and I'd get up and I'd hit the snooze and I'd scurry back under the covers anyway, and I'd do that a few times. And then I would put it up in high places and places that were hard to reach. And I eventually got so good that I could get down from the top bunk of my bed, step onto a chair, walk across the room, climb up onto a couch, get over the top of a bookshelf and find it hidden behind some books in a little nook and cranny of my bookshelf, and hit the snooze and get back in bed. And I could do it in my sleep. Not kidding. I would do that 2 or 3 times before I was aware that I was awake. It would be 20 minutes later, and I'd be like, did I just wake up? I would do that whole thing asleep. My roommate hated it, so sometimes he would move the chair that I used to step down, and that would wake me up, because I would get out of bed and I'd just hit the ground. So that's how that worked. But the things that we do over and over shape us. So I was so in a routine, so in a rhythm with my snooze alarm, that it actually became a pattern in my life that was easier to do than not do. I had to put in more effort not to snooze than to snooze. And this happens to us all the time in all areas of life. We get into patterns, we get into habits, things form us and shape us in ways that we get in sort of wagon ruts. And this isn't always a bad thing, and it's not something that's really optional. You're always being shaped by something. The question is, what are you being shaped by, and what are you becoming? As Christians, when we take initiative to say, I want to be shaped by God and by the gospel, I want the grace of God to be the thing that shapes me, this is what we call spiritual disciplines. It's when we're being intentional about saying, this, you, God, are the one I want to be the primary shaper and influencer of who I become. All things that we do, like prayer and fasting and all the other spiritual disciplines, are simply a way of putting ourselves in a place where we say, we want this to be what influences us. And so today, I want to talk to you about just one spiritual discipline, the discipline of worship. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about worship, and I gave this definition. Worship is putting something on display for the sake of delighting in it as an ultimate thing. It's display and delight. It's when we give our attention and our affections to God, when we give both intellectual light and cognitive light and emotional heat when we approach God. We look both with our thoughts and our emotions expressed towards God, our ultimate object of worship. And today I want to talk about how we do that, specifically in corporate singing. Now, I know that what we do with music is not the only thing you call worship, okay? We're very careful here in Grad Chapel to call all the different things that we do worship, whether we're praying or listening to Scripture or whatever, and all the things that we do throughout our day are opportunities for worship. Everything we do can be done to the glory of God. We offer our bodies as living sacrifices. But the Bible is very clear in commanding us, saying, worship God with song. Worship God with instruments, with your voice. Enter into a congregation of people who are singing praises to God. And I want to ask the question, why is that important? And specifically, what is happening? What ways are we being formed when we engage in the practice of corporate worship? I think the best place to start is to talk about what happens when we don't worship. What happens when we fail to worship? Psalm 103 tells us that one of the dangers of not worshiping is that we begin to forget. We forget God's benefits. We forget His goodness. And it's not simply an intellectual forgetting. If you skip church for 3 or 4 weeks, it's not going to just be harder to recall facts about God. That's not what it means. But your life is going to start to look like someone who doesn't know those truths about God. You're going to forget with your life what God is like. You're going to start acting as if God is not slow to anger, that He isn't abounding in love, that He isn't gracious and merciful. You're going to start acting as if He's accusatory and angry all the time. You're going to forget that He has forgiven you, that He heals your diseases. Worship is a way to remember, to recalibrate to reality, not just with our minds, but with our whole being. And we don't just forget. When we fail to worship, we also shrink. Our world gets smaller. We get caught up in trivialities. Psalm 103 tells us also that we are dust. that we're like grass, that our lives are like flowers that are just fleeting and passing with the wind. Now, it's not that details and trivialities are completely unimportant. We're also told by Jesus that God cares for the flowers of the field and the birds of the air, even though they're here today and gone tomorrow. God is involved in those things. But the problem is when we make those fleeting, trivial things, the passing things, the things that we see as most solid, the most lasting things, and we see them as things that we should put our hope in or things that we should fear, that is what the problem is. Our world begins to shrink, and we forget that the most solid reality is the fact that the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting, and that his kingdom rules over all. I do weddings from time to time. A couple of times a year, I'll perform a wedding. And one thing I've noticed, there's a pattern that happens. And the bride and the groom, really the bride and the mother of the bride, I should say, get caught up in some of the details of the wedding day. They get caught up in the picking of the colors and the flowers and the arrangements on the table and who's standing where and who's sitting next to whom and when the timing of the cutting of the cake and the throwing of the bouquet and all of the details of all of the procedures and when to update your relationship status on Facebook and all sorts of different details of the day become the focus. And there's an anxiety and a pressure about all of those things. And you can lose sight of what it's really about. Now, the details of a wedding are important. There's nothing wrong with paying attention to them. But sometimes we forget that after the day is done, it doesn't matter if a singer hit a wrong note in the song. It doesn't matter if the meal came out late. It doesn't matter if one of your groomsmen does a face plant in the middle of the ceremony. All of it, after the day is done, is either forgotten or becomes a funny story, and that's it. The thing that lasts, the things that matter, are the marriage, the love, the promises, the vows, the covenant. That is the thing that is going to ultimately shape the lives of the people involved. That is the thing that is going to be permanent and formational. Worship gets us back to focus on those things. Eugene Peterson says, failure to worship resigns us to a life of spasms and jerks at the mercy of every advertisement, every seduction, every siren. If we don't worship, we shrink. And not only that, if we don't worship, we die. Psalm 115 describes the fate of those who worship idols. We're told that in spite of appearances, idols are useless. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear. They have noses but cannot smell, hands but cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, throats but cannot make a sound. Idols can't do anything. They're lifeless, dead. And what happens to those who worship them? Verse 8 says, those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. This is what N.T. Wright calls the golden rule of spirituality. You become like what you worship. This is what he says. When you gaze in awe, admiration, and wonder at something or someone, you begin to take on something of the character of the object of your worship. Those who worship money become eventually human calculating machines. Those who worship sex become obsessed with their own attractiveness and prowess. Those who worship power will become more ruthless. You become like what you worship. For those who worship idols, that's bad news. But for those who worship the living God, it's good news. Wright goes on, he says, because you are made in God's image, worship makes you more truly human. When you gaze in love and gratitude at the God in whose image you were made, you do indeed grow. You discover more and more what it means to be fully alive. And conversely, when you give that same total worship to anyone or anything else, you shrink as a human being. This is why the discipline of worship is so vital. In the end, we only have two options, worship or die. But why music? Why does the scripture urge us to bring out the trumpets and the strings and the clashing cymbals and the harps and the pipes? Why are we supposed to make so much noise? It's because music is the language of the soul. And we all know this, right? Music moves us. It both expresses and shapes our emotions. There's some things that we experience that we can't really express until we've got music to go with it. There may be words that we could say to sort of express it, but it almost comes out flat and hollow, like it's empty when we say the words. But when you put the music to it, it starts to move you. It starts to be profound, okay? Just read any of the lyrics of any love song out loud, right? I've got sunshine on a cloudy day. When it's cold outside, I got the month of May. I guess you'd say, what can make me feel this way? My girl, my girl, my girl. I'm talking about my girl, my girl. I've got so much honey, the bees envy me. I've got a sweeter song than all the birds of the tree. I guess you'd say, what could make me feel this way? My girl, my girl, my girl. I'm talking about my girl. Ooh. But all of a sudden you put a little ba-doom-ba, ba-doom-ba, and your heart's going pitter-patter, 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 you know? It goes from cheesy to, oh, I'm in love. Music is so powerful. It's why we have fight songs for schools and national anthems for country. It's why you can be driving along and a random cheesy country song can have you pull over with tears streaming down your eyes because it just does it, you know? It's why when you're having a romantic candlelight dinner, you don't want the workout mix to come on at that time, you know? And vice versa. You don't want that love song while you're trying to work out. It's just not going to do it for you. It moves you. It expresses. It shapes you. The reason we use music in worship is because music is a tutor for our souls. Music has the power to unite both content and emotion. When an emotionally moving music is united with profound lyrics, it can help shape the way our heart reacts to those lyrics. It can help us respond appropriately to the truths that we're expressing. Music keeps us from slipping into the Gnostic error of thinking that if we just think the right things, our hearts and our lives will fall in alignment with the truths that we affirm. We need the help of our body, the stimulation of our ears, the use of our voices, the movements of our limbs in dance, at least for some of us, to help us bond with the meaning of the things that we're thinking about. And the psalmist knows that sometimes we need something to kickstart our heart. He's commanding his soul. He says, bless the Lord, O my soul. He's telling his soul to worship God. There's another place where he says, awake, O my soul. Sometimes we need to give our soul a jump start and say, worship God. When the forgetfulness and the numbness sets in, we need to call to our souls to give expression to what we believe, not just to affirm the truth, but to respond emotionally as a whole being to the truth. I think there's a myth that we are completely at the whim of whatever emotions wash over us in the moment. Now, some of the psychology students in here can probably add more nuance to this, but I found that in my experience, that it's not that I have complete control of my emotions. I can't just decide I'm going to feel this and I'm going to feel that, but my thoughts, my actions, my decisions can help discipline and move my emotions in the right way. And it actually helps a lot more if I've got music. The psalmist says, awake, O my soul. And then the next thing he says is, awake, O harp. At the same time as he says, soul, worship God, he says, I'm going to start to play. I'm going to start singing a song. Because the music can train your heart to respond in the right way to the truth that you're affirming. And that's why music can't be taken lightly. It's powerful. And anything that's powerful can be used in an abusive and a manipulative way. Music leaders have to take special care to select songs with lyrics that are worth being moved by. They need to make sure that people understand the words that they're singing. They need to make sure that the emotional tone of the music fits the lyrical content. You don't want to abuse the power of music. And yet, even with the possibility of manipulation, music is still good. It's the gift that God gave us. He gave it to us as an expression of our emotions and a tutor for our hearts to rightly respond to the truth. And this isn't something that just happens in the moment you're listening to a song. It's a gradual thing that happens over the course of time. It's not just that you hear one song and all of a sudden your emotions are set right. It's the course of time of expressing your thoughts and your words in music that tunes your heart. I think of that song, Come Thou Fount. Tune my heart to sing your praise. It's this gradual tuning of the instrument of our soul to be properly worshipers. So here's the application I have for you. It's very, very simple. Sing. Throw yourself into music during worship. Give your voice wholeheartedly. Move or dance if you want, if that's your thing. Let your heart be released to follow the flow of the melody. Let the discipline of corporate worship have its effect on you. I say that, and I know it's simple, but it's not always easy. There are a couple of barriers that tend to stand in the way. Two of them are these: sentimentalism and cynicism. Kind of two opposite errors. On the one side, we have sentimentalism. As I said, worship ought to involve your emotions, but sometimes when we focus on emotions in worship, it becomes a danger. There's a danger of pursuing emotion for emotion's sake, as if we just want to whip up strong emotions in sort of an artificial way. And we tend to sing songs that just focus on how strong our passions and our desires and our urges are without focusing on the object of our passions and our desires and our urges. We end up continually taking our emotional temperature, saying, oh, was this a good worship service? Well, if I felt a strong emotional response, it was good. And we're always trying to stay on fire and in a state of an emotional ecstasy. And we have to remember a couple of things. First of all, that kind of on-fire state of heightened emotions it's not possible to perpetuate that all the time. And then, other than that, we also need to know that we're not aiming directly at an emotional experience, okay? It's sort of like this. If your emotions are a big street sign, like a big arrow that's pointing at something, it's supposed to be pointing at God. Sentimentalism is when you stop and stare at the street sign, you polish the street sign, you talk about the street sign, you look at it, rather than saying, I'm going to follow the street sign to the object that it's pointing to. I'm going to make sure the street sign is pointing in the right direction. Street sign matters, but it's not the end all. The other thing to remember is this, is that, again, we're not primarily concerned with individual worship experiences. The discipline of worship, like all spiritual disciplines, is not about just the one time you do it. It's about what happens when you make a practice of it over the course of your life. So if you're in a worship service, this is just like to let you off the hook a little bit. If it's an emotional dud for you, don't freak out. It's not a spiritual crisis, okay? It might just be that you had a big breakfast and your body is spending more time digesting the food than giving you an emotional experience. It might be that your emotions have been spent on other things in your life that are worthy of giving emotion to, and you just don't have the energy here and now to do that. That is okay. It's what happens over the course of your life as you practice worship. How does your emotional response to God begin to be shaped and formed because of that practice? Of course, I want to make sure that I don't downplay the importance of emotions and feelings. We are in an academic context, so I know the bias is strongly towards the cognitive. Just because it's an emotional expression doesn't mean it's mere sentimentalism, okay? The difference between sentimentalism and real, proper emotion in worship is this, okay? Imagine a teenage boy sitting in his room listening to a love song, imagining a dream girl who he's never met that he just wants to be in love with, okay? He's listening to this love song, it's moving him. He's in love with the feeling of being in love. That's sentimentalism. But imagine I'm at a wedding with my wife, and that same song comes on, and I take her hand, and we go out onto the dance floor, and we hold each other, and we dance, and we look into each other's eyes, and we listen to the exact same song, and we feel the emotions that it stirs up. Is that cheap manipulation? Is that false emotion? No, it's exactly what the song was meant to do, to encourage real love. That's the difference. That's what we're looking for in worship. Of course, I think that most of us probably err on the other side. We're not just sentimental, we're cynical. And this is very common in a higher ed context. Grad school is designed to encourage critical thinking, but there's a problem when that critical thinking enters into a worship service and it becomes a critical spirit. Instead of entering into the experience of worship, we stand apart from it. We assess it, we evaluate it, we dissect it, we judge it. I cannot tell you how many times, this is an act of repentance, I've gone to church, and on the car ride home, I've ranted to my wife about how I would have done things differently. This song expressed this way. That wasn't nuanced enough. A more theologically accurate way of doing it would have been this. And did you hear that song? It emphasized this so much, and we should have emphasized that. And the preacher, he said this, but I would have said that. And here's the thing. My critiques might have been right. There might have been a better way to do it. They might have done things just a little bit off. But that's not the point. The point is, in cultivating a spirit of criticism, I've removed myself from the experience of worship. I've stepped back so that I'm not a part of what's going on there. And not only have I stepped back, I've stepped above and I've said, I'm going to be the judge of this. And over time, what happens is I realized that I was no longer entering into worship when I went to church and was in the service. And the discipline of worship was no longer having its effect on me. My heart was no longer being tuned by that to be more and more in love with God and more responsive. I was actually using it as a way to build in more hardness in my heart, to be less responsive, because I stepped back rather than entering in. And I'm not saying you should check your mind at the door when you go into a worship service, but I am saying that you need to work very, very hard, that the critical thoughts that you're developing that are very, very important here do not taint that experience, that you enter into a posture of humility and trust in your leaders. I found myself just sniping at worship leaders and pastors all the time. Just a Monday morning quarterback, backseat driver. That's all I was doing. It was really ironic that I found that by the end of my training, I was more charitable towards my theological and intellectual opponents when I was reading them, trying to give them a fair hearing when I was reading what they said, than the worship pastor who week in and week out labors for the sake of my soul. That was a problem. And I warn you guys because I know it's a danger for us in this context, and I don't want it to happen to you. Sentimentalism cheapens worship, but cynicism corrodes worship, and both keep us from actively being shaped by the practice of corporate worship, from allowing our hearts to be tuned to love God more and respond to His will. We were designed to worship. Worship is why God gave us emotions. It's why He gave us intellects. It's why He gave us bodies with voices that can sing and ears that can hear and limbs that can move and dance and play instruments. Worship is the reason we have music. And I wonder if God gave us the gift of song because it reflects a little bit of His image. Zephaniah 3:17 tells us that God sings. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save you. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by His love. He will exult over you with loud singing. Imagine that. The thunderous voice of the living God singing in joy because He loves you. We were made to delight in God, and the good news is, by His grace, God also delights in us. God is gracious and slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name be glory. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Let's worship God.